The legacy of Mesopotamia is still visible today in old parts of Cairo. The wealthier houses contain harems where women were segregated in order to prevent social contact with men who were not part of the family.
You have this ideology in architectural form. The house is enclosed by high walls. The male space is on the ground floor so that there's easy access for the male visitors, and the female spaces are on the upper floors where they could overlook these male spaces. It served the purposes of secluding the women from strange male eyes. At the same time, it allowed women privacy to socialize without interference from the males.
Segregating women and making them wear veils were just part of the process of turning women into private property. Women had to wear veils in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. So did respectable women in classical Greece and Rome. Women in medieval Europe were still veiling their hair. And even in our grandmother's time, women still wore veils on special occasions. Today, almost everybody has forgotten that the veil comes from an ancient upheaval that also brought us tyranny and endless war. But it does. Every state echoes the first state. Hierarchy, militarism, male domination.
Today, in this great meeting place and throughout the land, we the people celebrate America. Please welcome President-elect Bill Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, Vice President-elect Al Gore and Mrs. Gore.
Like anybody trying to run a mass civilization, Bill Clinton must get millions of people to pay taxes, work together, obey orders from a distant capital. That's so hard to do that until recently, all mass societies had to be dictatorships. But Bill Clinton doesn't have to be a dictator. He can actually try to talk people into cooperating because he has all the technology of mass communications available to him.
Our country for the American people, to celebrate not a victory of party or persons, but the common ground we call America.
But what was it like before mass media? Go all the way back to ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago. No human being has ever lived in anything bigger than a village. And suddenly here we are in the world's first unified state. And we have a little problem: how to run it. Think of the number of people involved: 50,000, 100,000, 500,000. And remember that the ancient Egyptians, the ancient everybody, lived in a world with no mass communications. No radio, no television, no books, no newspapers. Hardly anybody could even read and write. So they had no way to talk things over as a mass society, no way to reach a consensus, no way to agree voluntarily on what ought to be done. So somebody had to give the orders and everybody else had to obey. When we left the villages, we had to leave equality behind too. A mass society without mass communications has to be a dictatorship. But it doesn't have to go in for militarism, and it doesn't have to destroy women's rights. Egypt was one of the few ancient kingdoms where all the elements of patriarchy did not arrive at the same time. In fact, the early Egyptians, at least, accepted no more of the patriarchal order than they absolutely had to. The very first kings behaved quite badly, but mass society in Egypt did not become a permanent nightmare of exploitation and oppression. As soon as they could, the Egyptians moved away from the terror of the founding times. They even gave up building pyramids eventually and satisfied themselves with more modest temples. In fact, Egypt became the great exception, a mass society that managed to keep a lot of the old village values. And women still had a place both in religion and in the real world.
Before the coming of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, patriarchy was dominant, but it tolerated the presence of goddesses. So we see goddesses juxtaposed to gods in the religious ideologies. The earlier the period, the more dominant the female figure is. In Pharaonic Egypt, the queen legitimized the kingship of the ruler.
In Egypt, women owned land and ran businesses. They moved freely in public and were close to being equal partners with their husbands. Occasionally, Egyptian women even ruled the country in their own right. Queen Hatshepsut reigned for 20 years and built this temple. She wore the customary fake beard of the pharaoh on ceremonial occasions, but the Egyptians, by and large, didn't seem to mind being ruled by a woman. Beneath these sands lies the city of Lahoum, briefly Egypt's capital over 3,000 years ago. Nick Millett, the curator of Egyptology at the Royal Ontario Museum, is overseeing the dig.
The sharp contrast that has always impressed me is the difference between the status of women in Egypt and that in, shall we say, classical Greece. The ancient Greeks were a very peculiar bunch indeed, and they were basically terrified of their womenfolk. I don't say that lightly, I really believe this. If you will go over Greek mythology, you'll find that almost all the monsters are female, and that must surely mean something. This did not happen in Egypt. A man had his womenfolk around him. This gives the whole court life a kind of a feminine quality. The art shows extremely fine linen garments on the women, through which the bodies show very clearly. Women's clothing particularly, which I have kind of an interest in at this time, it does develop, new styles appear, and in many cases you can date a picture on a tomb wall by the fashions of the moment.
It was not a misfortune to be born a girl in ancient Egypt. Nobody'd even heard of the veil. Why this huge difference between Egypt and other places? Ancient Egypt lived along a river in a desert so wide that early armies couldn't cross it. To the north was open sea. So for almost 2,000 years, ancient Egypt was safe from attack by other civilized states. But Egypt's luck eventually ran out. Around 1600 BC, the first invaders arrived.